Blood dripped steadily onto the imported Italian marble, pooling around a shattered baccarat crystal vase. Brittany, breathless and bruised, clutched a cracked iPhone with trembling, swollen fingers. She had one number saved under a single letter. When the deep, aristocratic voice answered, she whispered 5 words, "Can you come get me?" The line went dead. 17 minutes later, the massive iron gates of the most secure private estate in Connecticut were ripped entirely from their hinges. The king had arrived. Brittany Gallagher knew she took up space. In a world defined by the razor-sharp collarbones and hollowed cheeks of the ultra-wealthy, her body was a soft, substantial landscape. At 240 pounds, she was a woman of generous curves, thick thighs, and a round, gentle face framed by unruly auburn curls. Most of her life she had been taught to apologize for her size, to shrink herself into the background. Working as a live-in maid for the Van der Linden family on Round Hill Road in Greenwich, Connecticut, shrinking was not just preferred, it was a survival requirement. The Van der Linden estate was a sprawling 32-room monstrosity of limestone and glass, a fortress of old money and new cruelty. Victoria Van der Linden, the matriarch, was a woman whose veins seemed to run with liquid nitrogen, but it was her son Preston who was the true terror of the household. 26, perpetually intoxicated, on 25-year-old Macallan and unchecked privilege, Preston viewed the staff not as employees but as property, and he had a particular, venomous disdain for Brittany. He despised her for her size, mocking her relentlessly, yet he was perversely obsessed with tormenting her, as if her quiet dignity was a personal insult to his power. It was a torrential Tuesday night in late October. The wind howled off the Long Island Sound, lashing rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand dining room. The Van der Lindens had hosted a private dinner party for a dozen hedge fund managers and local politicians. By midnight, the guests had departed, leaving behind a disastrous trail of half-eaten caviar, spilled Pinot Noir, and crushed lilies. Brittany, her feet aching in her sensible black orthopedics, was tasked with the cleanup. Preston had stayed behind in the parlor, drinking heavily. As Brittany knelt to gather the shards of a wineglass he had carelessly swept off a side table, she heard his heavy, erratic footsteps approaching. "Look at you," Preston slurred, leaning heavily against the archway, a half-empty crystal decanter dangling from his grip. "Like a fat little pig rooting in the mud. Does your mother know what a pathetic, sloppy mess you turned out to be, B?" Brittany kept her eyes glued to the hardwood floor, sweeping the glass into a silver dustpan. "I'll be out of your way in a moment, Mr. Preston. You're always in the way." He spat, his tone darkening. He took a step forward, the stench of stale alcohol and expensive Tom Ford cologne washing over her. "You take up half the damn room. Disgusting." He kicked the dustpan out of her hands. The silver clattered violently across the room, scattering broken glass across the Persian rug. Brittany flinched instinctively, bringing her arms up to shield her face. She tried to stand her knees, protesting, but before she could fully rise, Preston's hand lashed out. He grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanking her backward. Pain erupted in Brittany's scalp as she crashed to her knees. She cried out, grabbing at his wrist. "Please stop." "Shut up!" Preston roared. With his free hand, he swung the heavy crystal decanter. It struck the side of her head with a sickening thud. The world tilted on its axis. Brittany hit the floor hard, the cold Italian marble pressing against her cheek. Blood instantly welled from a gash above her left eye, blinding her. Victoria Van der Linden appeared at the top of the sweeping mahogany staircase, wrapped in a silk La Perla robe. She looked down at the scene, the blood, the broken glass, her son panting with rage, and Brittany curled into a trembling ball on the floor. "Preston, darling," Victoria said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Don't ruin the rugs. Have the driver dispose of her when you're finished." She turned and walked back into the shadows of the second floor. The tacit permission snapped whatever fragile leash Preston had left. He kicked Brittany in the ribs. The crack was audible. Brittany screamed a raw, ragged sound and scrambled desperately backward. Adrenaline, pure and primal, flooded her system. She pushed herself up, ignoring the agonizing stab in her side, and bolted down the service hallway toward the kitchen. "Get back here, you fat bitch!" Preston bellowed, stumbling after her. Brittany threw her weight against the heavy oak door of the butler's pantry, slipping inside and slamming it shut. She fumbled with the deadbolt, sliding it home just as Preston's full weight crashed against the outside of the door. The wood groaned but held. "Open the door, B," he screamed, pounding his fists against the oak. "You're dead. Do you hear me? You're nothing. Brittany collapsed against the stainless steel prep counter, sliding down to the cool tile floor. She was trapped. There were no windows in the pantry. She pressed a trembling hand to her head, her fingers coming away slick and crimson. Her chest heaved, every breath agonizing. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen was cracked from the fall, but it still worked. She opened her contacts. She had no family left. The police in Greenwich were on the Van der Linden payroll. Calling them would only speed up her demise. But there was one contact, saved under the letter A. 3 months ago, the Van der Lindens had hosted an exclusive charity gala. Brittany had been serving champagne. She had accidentally bumped into a towering man in a bespoke Brioni suit, spilling a drop of Moet onto his polished Oxford shoe. Terrified, she had immediately dropped to her knees to wipe it, but the man had gently caught her wrist, pulling her back to her feet. He had pale, flawless skin and eyes so dark they looked like endless voids. Instead of anger, he had looked at the ugly, purple bruise blooming on her forearm, a gift from Preston a few days prior. The man had discreetly slipped a heavy, matte black business card into her apron pocket. It bore only a gold crest and a phone number. "My name is Alistair," he had murmured, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to settle deep in her bones. "You do not belong in a cage with feral dogs. If the monsters in this house ever forget their manners, call me." Brittany hadn't known who he was. She hadn't known he was Alistair Covington, CEO of Covington Holdings, a man whose wealth dwarfed the Van der Lindens. And she certainly hadn't known he was a creature that had stalked the earth since the fires of Alexandria. With blood dripping steadily from her chin, Brittany tapped the A. It rang only once. "Brittany!" His voice was a dark velvet anchor in the chaotic storm of her panic. He knew exactly who was calling from the untraceable number. "Can you come get me?" she whispered, a sob tearing through her bruised ribs. Outside the door, Preston began smashing a heavy iron fire poker against the wood. Crack. "Where are you?" Alistair's voice changed. The smooth, aristocratic charm vanished, replaced by something ancient, cold, and utterly terrifying. "The pantry," she gasped. "He's breaking the door." 17 minutes, Alistair commanded, the sound of glass shattering echoing through his end of the line. "Stay away from the door. I am coming." The line clicked dead. 20 miles away, nestled deep within a heavily forested 400-acre estate in Bedford, New York, Alistair Covington stood in the center of his expansive library. The room was a sanctuary of first editions, roaring fireplaces, and centuries of accumulated secrets. He was currently entertaining 3 members of his inner council, ancient vampires who controlled vast networks of global finance and politics. When the phone in his pocket had vibrated on the dedicated frequency he reserved for only one person, Alistair had raised a hand, silencing a debate over a European acquisition. When he heard Brittany's tearful, terrified whisper, the unmistakable sound of wood splintering under a heavy weapon in the background, a predatory stillness fell over him. The temperature in the library plummeted by 20 degrees in a single second. Frost bloomed rapidly across the edges of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The other 3 vampires in the room instantly stepped back, sensing the sudden catastrophic shift in their king's aura. Alistair's human facade, the charming billionaire, the cultured philanthropist, evaporated. His eyes, normally a dark, warm hazel, bled into a solid abyssal black. His jaw tightened, the sound of his fangs extending, echoing in the silent room like the drawing of steel blades. 17 minutes, he had told her. "Stay away from the door. I am coming." Alistair didn't walk out of the room. He blurred. In the span of a human heartbeat, he was out the heavy oak doors, crossing the grand foyer, and vaulting down the stone steps into the subterranean garage. He bypassed the armored Maybach and the vintage Ferraris, sliding into a sleek matte black Aston Martin DBS Superleggera. The V12 engine roared to life, a mechanical beast answering the call of an immortal predator. The garage doors shot open, and Alistair launched the car into the torrential storm. He didn't drive like a human. A human relies on slow mortal reflexes and restricted vision. Alistair saw the rain as suspended slow-motion droplets. He saw the winding, treacherous Bedford roads with absolute clarity in the pitch black. The Aston Martin tore down Route 22, the speedometer rocketing past 140 miles per hour. The heavy tires hydroplaned, but Alistair's hands on the wheel were supernatural anchors forcing the ton of metal to obey his will. His mind, however, was in that pantry with Brittany. He had noticed her the moment she walked into the gala 3 months ago. In a room full of hollow, vain creatures desperate for his attention, Brittany had been a beacon of genuine warmth and quiet suffering. He saw the way she moved, acutely aware of her size, trying so hard not to disturb the space around her. He had found her curves beautiful, her soft, round face utterly captivating, a stark contrast to the sharp, starving predators he usually associated with. But it was the scent of her blood that had nearly brought him to his knees. It was sweet, complex, rich, with a resilience that spoke of a pure, unbroken soul. And then he had seen the bruise. He had smelled the fear on her when she looked at the young Van der Linden heir. Alistair had nearly slaughtered the boy right there in the ballroom, but centuries of discipline had stayed his hand. He had given her his private number, hoping she would use it to ask for money for a new life, for an escape. He hadn't expected her to call while being hunted. "Hold on, my sweet girl," Alistair thought, his foot bearing the accelerator. Hold on. Back at the Round Hill Road estate, time was agonizingly slow for Brittany. 7 minutes had passed. The pantry door was yielding. Preston had abandoned the fire poker and retrieved a heavy steel crowbar from the garage. The sharp metal beak tore through the center panel of the oak door, sending a shower of jagged splinters into the small room. Brittany dragged herself into the furthest corner, wedging her body between a towering industrial refrigerator and the wall. Her chest burned with every breath. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to make herself as small as possible, trying to disappear. "I can see you, you fat cow," Preston cackled, peering through the jagged hole he had created. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. "Look at you. You think hiding is gonna save you? No one is coming for you? No one gives a shit about you?" Brittany clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the blood drying on her cheek. The insults hurt almost as much as the physical blows. For years she had endured society telling her she was worthless because of her weight, because she wasn't a size 0, because she didn't fit their narrow mold of humanity. Preston was the vocalization of every dark, self-hating thought she had ever fought against. Crack! The lock mechanism groaned. 12 minutes. Alistair blew past the Greenwich town line. The rain was a solid sheet of grey, but he didn't slow down. He took the winding curves of Round Hill Road at 120 miles per hour, the Aston Martin drifting violently before snapping back into line. He could smell it now. Even through the rain, miles away, the predatory, tracking senses of the king locked onto the metallic copper scent of Brittany's blood. It drove him to the brink of frenzy. 15 minutes. The pantry door finally gave way. With a sickening crunch, the hinges tore free from the frame, and the heavy oak door crashed to the tile floor. Preston stood in the doorway, chest heaving, the crowbar gripped tightly in his hands. He smiled, a grotesque, drunken stretching of his lips. "End of the line, B?" Preston stepped into the pantry. Brittany pressed herself against the cold steel of the refrigerator, her hands raised defensively. "Preston, please. I'll leave. I'll pack my things right now. You'll never see me again." "Oh, you're definitely leaving?" Preston sneered, raising the crowbar. "In a body bag. Mom already paid off the medical examiner. You tripped and fell down the stairs, B. Such a tragedy. The clumsy maid couldn't handle her own weight." He swung the crowbar backward, preparing for a devastating strike. Brittany squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the end. 16 minutes and 55 seconds. Outside the estate, a pair of 10-foot-tall wrought-iron security gates stood locked and armed. The Aston Martin didn't even tap its brakes. The 2-ton vehicle slammed into the center of the gates at 90 miles per hour. The impact was deafening. The massive steel hinges sheared off like brittle twigs, and the gates were thrown violently onto the manicured lawn. The car screeched to a halt in front of the grand entrance, destroying a centuries-old marble fountain. 17 minutes. The blaring screech of the perimeter security alarms echoed through the massive house. Preston froze the crowbar, suspended in mid-air. He looked over his shoulder toward the hallway, a flicker of confusion breaking through his drunken rage. "What the hell?" he muttered. Before he could lower his weapon, the alarms abruptly died, replaced by a silence so profound, so heavy, it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the mansion. Then came the sound. The double front doors of the Van der Linden estate, built of reinforced solid mahogany and steel cores to withstand a hurricane, did not open. They exploded. Chunks of wood and twisted metal blasted down the main hallway, embedding themselves into the drywall and shattering expensive portraits. Upstairs, Victoria Van der Linden screamed in terror, dropping her phone. Preston dropped the crowbar. It clanged loudly against the pantry floor. He stepped out of the kitchen and into the main hallway, squinting into the gloom of the foyer. The storm raged outside, throwing flashes of lightning into the house. In the center of the debris stood Alistair Covington. He was impeccably dressed in his bespoke suit, completely untouched by the rain, but he looked nothing like a man. The sheer suffocating gravity of his presence made Preston's knees buckle. Alistair's eyes were pools of liquid midnight, and the skin around them was cracked with dark, venomous veins. When he inhaled, tracking the scent of blood, a low, guttural growl vibrated from his chest, shaking the fine china in the cabinets around them. Who the hell are you? Preston stammered, backing up, suddenly realizing how entirely mortal he was. This is private property, I'll shoot you. I have a gun. Alistair didn't walk. He moved with a terrifying, stuttering speed, standing by the door 1 second, and in the next microsecond he was inches from Preston's face. Preston didn't even have time to blink. Alistair's hand shot out, wrapping around Preston's throat. He lifted the 26-year-old heir off the ground with zero effort, his arm locked straight. Preston choked his hands, scrabbling uselessly against Alistair's iron grip, his legs kicking in the empty air. You, Alistair whispered, his voice a chorus of nightmares, have touched something that belongs to me. With his free hand, Alistair reached out and casually grabbed Preston's right arm, the arm that had swung the decanter. He didn't twist it, he simply applied pressure. The radius and ulnar bones shattered with a sound like a rifle crack. Preston tried to scream, but Alistair's grip on his throat strangled the sound into a wet, pathetic gurgle. Tears of agony streamed down Preston's face. The arrogance, the entitlement, the cruel mockery, all of it was instantly burned away by sheer, unadulterated terror. Victoria rushed down the stairs, stopping halfway, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. Preston, oh my God, Preston, let him go. Alistair slowly turned his head to look at the matriarch. The look in his black eyes pinned her to the stairs like a physical spear. Victoria van der Linden, Alistair said, his voice cold and loud enough to fill the entire estate. By tomorrow morning, your hedge fund will be liquidated. Your bank accounts will be seized. This house will burn to the ground. You will be penniless, destitute, and erased from the society you prize so deeply. If you ever speak a word of this night, if you ever breathe the name Brittany Gallagher again, I will return, and I will not be as merciful as I am being right now. Victoria collapsed onto the stairs, sobbing hysterically, unable to look away from the monster holding her son. Alistair tossed Preston aside like a piece of garbage. The young man crashed into a heavy oak credenza and crumpled to the floor, unconscious, his shattered arm twisted at a grotesque angle. Alistair turned away from them, the monstrous aura instantly softening. The dark veins faded from beneath his eyes. The abyssal black receded, replaced by the warm, grounding hazel. He stepped over the threshold of the broken pantry door. Brittany was still wedged in the corner, shaking uncontrollably, her hands covering her face. She had heard the crack of bone. She had heard the threat. She was terrified that the monster who had just destroyed Preston would now turn his wrath on her. Brittany, Alistair said softly. She flinched. Alistair dropped to one knee, uncaring of the blood and water soaking into his expensive trousers. He kept his distance, making himself smaller, non-threatening. Look at me. Slowly, hesitantly, she lowered her hands. She looked at him through her swollen, bruised eye. He didn't look at her with pity, and he certainly didn't look at her with disgust. He looked at her like she was the most precious, fragile artifact in the world. You came, she whispered, her voice cracking. I promised, he replied gently. He reached out, his movements agonizingly slow, until his cool, smooth fingers brushed against her uninjured cheek. A wave of profound, narcotic calmness washed over her. The searing pain in her ribs dulled. The throbbing in her head quieted. It was vampire glamour, channeled purely to soothe her trauma. I can't walk, she sobbed softly, the adrenaline finally leaving her system, replaced by utter exhaustion. My ribs, and I'm too heavy to carry. Even now, battered and bleeding, society's cruel conditioning forced her to apologize for her body. Alistair's heart ached. He leaned in close. My beautiful Brittany, to me you weigh nothing at all. He slipped one arm under her knees and the other around her back. With smooth, effortless grace, he stood up, lifting her into his arms. Brittany gasped softly, wrapping her arms around his thick neck, burying her face into the lapel of his coat. He smelled like cedar, old paper, and rain. She felt completely, undeniably safe. Alistair carried her out of the pantry, stepping over Preston's unconscious body without a downward glance. He walked past Victoria, who was still weeping on the stairs, and stepped out through the shattered front doors into the raging storm. He carried her toward the waiting Aston Martin, leaving the ruins of the Van der Linden legacy behind them. The king had his queen, and the world was about to change. Rain battered the sleek windshield of the Aston Martin as it devoured the miles between Greenwich and Bedford. Inside the cabin, the ferocious roar of the storm was muffled, replaced by the low, steady hum of the V12 engine and the soft blast of the climate control. Brittany lay reclined in the passenger seat, wrapped securely in Alistair's ruined Brioni suit jacket. The cashmere and silk blend smelled intoxicatingly of his cedar wood and petrichor scent, grounding her as she drifted in and out of a concussed haze. Every time a sob hitched in her chest, Alistair's right hand would leave the steering wheel, his cool, long fingers gently brushing the pulse point at her wrist. The touch sent a localized wave of numbness through her fractured ribs and throbbing skull, a supernatural anesthetic that kept her from going into deep shock. "Stay with me, Brittany," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the treacherous, winding blacktop of Route 22. "We are almost home." Home, the word sounded utterly alien to her. For 5 years, the cramped, windowless servants' quarters above the Van der Linden garage had been her assigned container. Before that, it was a string of cold foster houses where the refrigerator was padlocked and her size was treated as a moral failure. She had never had a home. The Aston Martin slowed, turning onto a private, unmarked gravel road lined with towering ancient hemlocks. A pair of massive, imposing wrought-iron gates swung open silently at their approach, guided by an invisible security network. They descended a steep, winding driveway that seemed to plunge directly into the bedrock of the earth, entering a subterranean garage that looked more like a pristine, high-tech aircraft hangar. Alistair parked the car and was instantly at her door. He lifted her as effortlessly as if she were made of spun glass. Brittany buried her face in his neck, ashamed of the blood and grime she was smearing on his pristine white dress shirt. "I'm ruining your clothes," she slurred, her heavy eyelids drooping. "I own a textile mill in Milan B. I can make more shirts," he replied softly, his chest vibrating against her cheek. "I cannot make another you." He carried her through a set of biometric steel doors and into an immaculate, brightly lit medical suite that rivaled the intensive care unit at New York Presbyterian. A man in grey scrubs was already waiting, setting out sterile instruments on a stainless steel tray. "Dr. Montgomery," Alistair said, his voice instantly adopting a clipped, authoritative edge. "Blunt force trauma to the left temporal region. 3, possibly 4 fractured ribs on the right side. Deep lacerations on the scalp." Dr. Harrison Montgomery, a brilliant human trauma surgeon who had been inextricably bound to the Covington Coven for 2 decades, nodded without asking questions. "Bring her to the striker bed, sir. Let's get a look at her." Alistair set her down with excruciating care on the soft, padded medical bed. The bright overhead LED lights were agonizing. Brittany instinctively curled inward, crossing her thick arms over her stomach. Her soaked maid's uniform clung to her, every roll, every curve she had been taught to hate. Panic spiked in her chest. A doctor meant an examination. An examination meant being stripped exposed and inevitably lectured about her BMI, her weight, her physical inadequacy. "No, please," she whimpered, her hands gripping the edges of the ruined dress. "Please don't look at me. I'm too big. I'm so gross right now." Alistair's expression shattered. In a blur of motion, he was kneeling beside the bed, his hands gently encompassing her trembling wrists. He didn't use his vampire glamour to calm her. He used his raw, devastating honesty. "Brittany Gallagher," he said, his voice a fierce, low rumble. "Look at me." She forced her swollen eye open. "There is not a single inch of you that is anything less than magnificent." Alistair vowed, his dark hazel eyes burning with a desperate sincerity. "You are soft, you are substantial, and you are entirely beautiful. The filth in that house made you believe you were a burden, because they lacked the strength to carry you. I do not lack strength. Do you understand me?" Tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks, washing away the dried blood. She gave a tiny, imperceptible nod. Harrison, Alistair said, not breaking eye contact with her. Treat her. If you cause her an ounce of unnecessary pain, I will break your fingers. Understood, Mr. Covington, Harrison replied calmly, entirely unfazed by the threat. Over the next hour, Harrison worked with quiet, clinical precision. He administered a local anesthetic, stitched the jagged wound above her eye, and carefully wrapped her torso in a tight, stabilizing brace. Alistair refused to leave the room. He stood in the corner, a silent, brooding sentinel, his gaze never wavering from Brittany's face. When the human medicine had reached its limit, Harrison stepped back. The ribs will take 6 weeks to knit. The concussion is severe. She needs absolute bed rest. Leave us, Alistair commanded softly. Harrison bowed his head and exited the suite. Alistair approached the bed. He pulled a silver-engraved pocket knife from his trousers and without a flinch drew the blade across the pad of his own thumb. A single drop of impossibly thick crimson blood welled up. The mortal medicine will keep you alive, Alistair whispered, pressing his bleeding thumb gently against her lower lip. But this will take away the pain. Just a drop, my sweet girl. Drink. Brittany, trusting him completely, parted her lips. The moment the vampire blood touched her tongue, it tasted like pure, unadulterated electricity. A rush of molten heat surged down her throat, radiating outward to her chest and head. The agonizing, sharp stabbing in her ribs vanished instantly. The oppressive fog of the concussion evaporated, leaving her mind crystal clear. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her body going entirely limp against the mattress. Sleep now, Bee, Alistair murmured, brushing a damp curl from her forehead. You are safe. No one will ever hurt you again. Brittany awoke to the sensation of falling into a cloud. She opened her eyes, gasping softly, expecting the cramped, mildew-scented ceiling of the garage apartment. Instead, her vision was filled with elaborate hand-painted Victorian crown molding and a massive crystal chandelier that refracted the morning sunlight. She was buried beneath layers of heavy silk-edged fretter linens on a bed large enough to comfortably sleep 5 people. The mattress conformed perfectly to her heavy frame, supporting her weight in a way she had never experienced. Slowly, she pushed herself up. The pain in her ribs was gone, replaced by a dull, distant ache. She looked down. Someone had changed her out of her bloody uniform and dressed her in a luxurious, plus-sized satin nightgown that draped elegantly over her stomach and thick thighs, making her feel like a Renaissance painting rather than a discarded maid. The heavy mahogany doors to the bedroom opened. Alistair stepped inside, carrying a large silver tray. He was no longer in his ruined suit, but wearing a casual, dark cashmere sweater that stretched over his broad chest and fitted trousers. He looked breathtakingly handsome, yet the intimidating, monstrous aura she had witnessed the night before was entirely absent. "Good morning," he said, offering a smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "Where am I?" Brittany asked, her voice raspy. "My private estate in Bedford." "You are in the master suite," he replied, setting the tray across her lap. "You've been asleep for nearly 30 hours. You need sustenance." Brittany looked at the tray and expected a bowl of clear broth or a sad, dry salad. Instead, her mouth watered at the sight of a massive, perfectly seared filet mignon, a mountain of rich butter-whipped potatoes, roasted asparagus thick with hollandaise sauce, and a pot of Earl Grey tea. "Eat," he commanded, gently sitting on the edge of the mattress. "All of it?" she asked, her old anxieties flaring. "But it's so much calories." "You are a woman, Brittany, not a bird," Alistair said firmly, his eyes dropping briefly appreciatively to the soft swell of her cleavage exposed by the satin gown. "Your body survived immense trauma. It requires fuel to rebuild. Do not starve yourself in my house." With a trembling hand, she picked up the fork. The food was exquisite, rich and heavy, and as she ate, Alistair watched her with an expression of pure, unadulterated devotion. It was unnerving yet intoxicating to be looked at with such hunger that had nothing to do with cruelty. "The Van der Lindens," she paused, swallowing a piece of steak. "Preston? What happened to him?" "Preston will spend the next several months undergoing reconstructive surgery on his arm," Alistair said, calmly pouring her a cup of tea. "He will do so without the comfort of his private insurance. At 9 a.m. yesterday, the SEC raided his mother's hedge fund. By noon, Chase private client froze all their assets due to an anonymous tip regarding massive offshore embezzlement. Goldman Sachs has blacklisted them. They are currently being evicted from the Greenwich property. They are, for all intents and purposes, erased." Brittany stared at him, the heavy silver fork slipping from her fingers. You did all that in a day. I am a man of substantial resources, Alistair said simply. I told you I would protect you. Before Brittany could process the sheer, terrifying scale of his power, a sharp, rhythmic knock echoed from the heavy bedroom doors. Without waiting for permission, the doors swung inward. A woman stood in the threshold. She was stunningly beautiful, with sharp, angular features, icy blonde hair pulled into a severe chignon, and a tailored Chanel suit that screamed old money. But it was her eyes that gave her away the same terrifying ancient depth that Alistair possessed. Genevieve! Alistair growled, the temperature in the room instantly dropping. I specifically instructed the council that I was not to be disturbed. Forgive me, Alistair, Genevieve Dupont said, stepping into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She cast a brief dismissive glance at Brittany. But you have created a political catastrophe of unprecedented proportions over a human pet. Watch your tongue. Alistair stood up, his body shielding Brittany from Genevieve's gaze. She is not a pet. Be that as it may, Genevieve continued, crossing her arms. You destroyed the Van der Linden Empire. Did you happen to check their ledger before you dismantled their lives out of misplaced chivalry? Alistair's jaw clenched. Their finances are not my concern. They are now, Genevieve countered, her voice laced with venom. Charles Van der Linden, before he died, sold 40% of his private equity firm to the Moreau cartel in Manhattan for protection and capital. By freezing their assets and seizing their properties, you just robbed the Moreaus of $600 million. Brittany's breath hitched. She knew the name Moreau. Even the sheltered staff in Greenwich whispered about the shadow family that ran the New York underground, a family notoriously known for their absolute brutal violence. Julian Moreau does not care about the human boy's broken arm, Genevieve said, her tone grave. But he cares very much about his money, and he knows exactly who orchestrated the SEC raid. You broke the 1978 Manhattan Accords, Alistair. You struck a protected asset without council approval. Alistair let out a dark, mocking laugh that sent shivers down Brittany's spine. Julian Moreau is a rat scurrying in the sewers of Wall Street. If he wants his money, tell him to come to Bedford and try to collect it. He doesn't want the money, Alistair, Genevieve said quietly, her icy eyes shifting past the king to lock onto Brittany. He wants compensation for the insult. He wants a life for a life. He sent a message this morning. He demanded the human. The silence that followed was absolute suffocating terror. Brittany shrank back against the pillows, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had escaped a monster, only to be thrown into the center of a war among gods. Alistair slowly turned his head to look at Genevieve. His human facade melted away entirely. His eyes bled into solid black, and the air in the room grew so dense it felt like being submerged in freezing water. Tell Julian Moreau, Alistair whispered, his voice vibrating with the promise of utter annihilation, that if he or his hounds step 1 foot into Connecticut, I will tear the skin from his body and wear it to his funeral. Brittany stays with me. Genevieve stared at Alistair for a long, calculating moment. The air between them crackled with lethal, invisible static, the pressure of 2 ancient predators locking horns. Finally, she offered a stiff, formal bow of her head. You are leading us into a slaughter for a mortal who will age and die before the century turns, Genevieve said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The council will not support you in this, Alistair. You stand alone against the Moreau cartel. I have stood alone for 800 years, Alistair replied, his tone devoid of any compromise. Get out of my house. Genevieve turned on her heel and swept from the room, the heavy mahogany doors clicking shut behind her. The oppressive chill in the air instantly evaporated, but the terror in Brittany's chest remained heavy and suffocating. Brittany threw the silk sheets off her legs. Her bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor, her knees trembling slightly as she stood. The dull ache in her wrapped ribs protested the sudden movement, but the panic clawing at her throat ignored the pain. She began frantically searching the room, opening the massive antique armoires. What are you doing? Alistair asked, the dark fury in his eyes dissolving the moment he looked at her. I need my clothes, Brittany stammered, pulling out a handful of empty velvet hangers. Where is my uniform? I have to go. Alistair crossed the room in a blur, materializing right in front of her. He gently but firmly caught her wrists. Brittany, stop. Your uniform was covered in blood. It was incinerated. Then give me something else. A coat, a blanket, anything. Tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks. You heard her, Alistair. They want to kill you. Because of me. I am a maid. I am a nobody. I can't let a war start because you felt sorry for the fat girl who got beaten up. Felt sorry for you? Alistair repeated the words, sounding like ash in his mouth. He released her wrists, stepping back as if physically struck by her accusation. Yes, Brittany cried, her hands flying to her stomach, defensively clutching the satin nightgown around her generous curves. It was a deeply ingrained habit, an instinct to hide the body she had been conditioned to despise. I know how the world works, Alistair. I know what people see when they look at me. I take up too much space. I'm a burden. I was a burden to my foster parents, a burden to the Van der Lindens, and now I'm a burden to you. I will not be the reason you lose everything. Just let me slip out the back. Moreau won't care about you if I turn myself over to... Silence. The command was soft, but it carried a preternatural weight that instantly locked her jaw. Alistair didn't look angry. He looked utterly devastated. He slowly sank to his knees on the hardwood floor, right in front of her. He, the king of the Eastern Covens, a creature of boundless wealth and terrifying power, knelt before a mortal woman who believed she was nothing. He reached out, taking her trembling, scarred hands in his large, cool palms. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, his breath ghosting over her skin. For centuries, I have walked through a world of ghosts, Alistair murmured, looking up at her with eyes that burned with a desperate, ancient reverence. I have surrounded myself with immortals who are beautiful, hollow, and utterly cruel. Then, 3 months ago, a woman walked into a ballroom. She was radiant. She was substantial. She possessed a heart so pure and a resilience so profound that my dead chest actually ached to be near her. Brittany let out a ragged sob, trying to pull her hands away, but he held fast. You do not take up too much space, Brittany, he vowed, moving his hands to softly grip her wide hips, his thumbs tracing the curve of her waist through the satin. The world is simply too small for the magnitude of your spirit. Do you think I destroyed the Van der Lindens? Out of pity, I destroyed them because they dared to lay hands on my queen. Bastien Moreau and his cartel of thugs could bring 1,000 mercenaries to my gates, and I would slaughter every last one of them before I let them touch a single hair on your head. He pressed his face to the soft swell of her stomach, his arms wrapping around her thick waist, holding her as if she were the only thing tethering him to the earth. You are not a burden, he whispered against the silk. You are my salvation. Please be. Do not ask me to let you go. I would rather burn in the sun. Brittany stood paralyzed, the breath knocked completely out of her lungs. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever touched her body, not with violence or disgust, but with absolute worship. She looked down at the dark hair of the immortal kneeling before her, and slowly her trembling fingers reached out, tangling into his thick locks. Okay, she breathed the word, a fragile surrender. Okay, Alistair, I'll stay. He let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief, pressing one last, lingering kiss to her stomach before rising back to his full, towering height. We have preparations to make, he said, his voice hardening back into the authoritative timbre of a general. Because Genevieve was right about one thing. Moreau is coming. By midnight, the Bedford estate had transformed from a luxurious sanctuary into a heavily fortified war room. The storm outside had intensified thunder, shaking the foundations of the library, where Alistair stood over a massive mahogany table strewn with architectural blueprints and satellite imagery. Standing opposite him was Dominic, his second in command. Dominic was a brutal, physically imposing vampire, with a face heavily scarred from the French Revolution, his loyalty to Alistair absolute. Brittany sat in a high-backed leather armchair by the roaring fireplace, wrapped in a thick cashmere throw, watching the two immortals strategize. "The perimeter is locked," Dominic reported, tracing a finger along the map. "We have 70 guards positioned in the woods, but Bastion Moreau isn't sending foot soldiers, Alistair. Our scouts intercepted a communication from Manhattan. They are sending the trackers." Alistair's jaw tightened. "The trackers are psychic hounds. They can only hunt if they have a scent." "That's just it, my king," Dominic said softly, his dark eyes flickering nervously toward Brittany. "It isn't about the money you cost them. It was never about the Van der Lindens. Moreau's seers tasted the rain when you brought her here. They smelled her blood on the wind." Alistair went completely still. "Explain." Dominic swallowed hard. "She isn't just a sweet-blooded mortal, Alistair. The seers identified her resonance. She is a sanguis regis, a vessel of the first sires." The crystal tumbler in Alistair's hand shattered into a dozen pieces, bourbon raining onto the blueprints. Brittany sat up straight, clutching the blanket. "What does that mean? What is a vessel?" Alistair turned to her, his expression a mixture of awe and absolute dread. He walked over, crouching beside her chair. "Mortal bloodlines are vast and diluted, but every few centuries a human is born carrying the dormant, unbroken genetic marker of the very first humans who fed the original vampires. Your blood it is a myth. It is ambrosia. If a vampire were to drain a sanguis regis, their power would multiply tenfold. They would become virtually unkillable." He looked back at Dominic. "Bastion Moreau wants to consume her to overthrow the Global Council." "Yes," Dominic nodded grimly. "And the trackers are coming. They can smell her royal resonance from 50 miles away. The wards on this house won't hide her for long." "Leave us, Dominic," Alistair commanded. Dominic bowed deeply and vanished from the library. Alistair looked at Brittany, his eyes tracing the soft lines of her face, the bandage above her brow. The stakes had just shifted from a territorial dispute to a supernatural world war, and she was the prize at the center. "They can track me," Brittany said, her voice shaking. "If I stay here, they will find a way in. They will tear this house apart." "There is a way to blind them," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum. He reached out, gently cupping her jaw. "But it requires your complete consent. It is ancient magic, and it is permanent." "What is it?" "A blood binding," Alistair explained, his thumb softly brushing her lower lip. "If I place my mark upon you, and our blood mixes, my aura will entirely eclipse yours. To the trackers, your scent will vanish. You will smell only of me. It will cloak you completely from their psychic sight." Brittany looked deep into his eyes. "What does a binding do?" "It ties our life forces together," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her throat. "I will feel your pain, and you will feel my strength. It claims you as mine, not as property, but as my equal, my queen. But to do this, I must bite you, Brittany, and you must drink from me." He waited, giving her the space to refuse to run. But Brittany didn't feel fear. For the first time in her life, sitting in front of this terrifying, beautiful monster, she felt an overwhelming sense of agency. The world had always taken from her, taken her dignity, her comfort, her safety. Alistair was offering her a shield. She let the cashmere throw slip from her shoulders. She tilted her head to the side, exposing the thick, soft column of her neck. Her pulse hammered visibly against her skin. "Do it," she whispered. Alistair's eyes dilated, entirely consumed by black. The fangs slid from his gums with a soft snick. He leaned in his cool breath, ghosting over her collarbone, sending a violent shiver down her spine. "I will be gentle, my brave girl," he murmured against her skin. He kissed her neck once, a soft, reverent press of his lips before his fangs pierced her flesh. Brittany gasped, her hands instinctively gripping his broad shoulders. There was a sharp, fleeting pinch, immediately followed by an overwhelming, intoxicating rush of pure euphoria. It wasn't pain, it was a fiery, molten pleasure that radiated from the bite, flooding her veins with heat. She felt the gentle, rhythmic pull as he drew her blood, the mythical sanguis regis that tasted like honey and power. Alistair groaned, a deep primal sound vibrating in his chest. Her blood was overwhelming, a supernova of energy that threatened to shatter his control, but he held back, taking only what was necessary. He pulled away, his eyes glowing with an ethereal, predatory light. He bit into his own wrist, tearing the flesh, and pressed the bleeding wound to her lips. "Drink, he commanded softly. She parted her lips, pressing her mouth to his wrist. The moment his blood hit her tongue, the world exploded into vibrant, blinding color. The lingering aches in her ribs vanished entirely, replaced by a surge of raw, crackling strength. She felt her senses sharpen. She could hear the individual raindrops hitting the glass outside, could smell the ozone in the storm, could feel the ancient, thrumming heartbeat of the immortal kneeling before her. As she swallowed a shimmering golden crest, the crest of the Covington line briefly illuminated on the skin of her neck, where he had bitten her before fading into the flesh, leaving behind 2 small, perfect puncture scars. The binding was complete. Alistair pulled his wrist away, his chest heaving. He rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily in the quiet library. The psychic tether between them snapped into place. Brittany could feel his absolute devotion, his fierce protectiveness, blooming in the center of her own chest. "They cannot see you now," Alistair whispered, his eyes closing. "You are hidden in my shadow." "Let them come," Brittany said, and for the first time in 24 years her voice held not a single trace of fear. The storm that raged outside the Bedford estate was nothing compared to the supernatural tempest brewing within its walls. Brittany stood by the towering arched windows of the library, the thick velvet curtains pulled back just enough to reveal the tree line. Through the newly forged psychic bond, she didn't just see the rain, she felt the humming electric tension of the perimeter wards. She felt Alistair's power coursing through her veins, a low, thrumming vibration that made her feel invincible. For the first time in her life, the heavy, substantial weight of her body felt like an anchor rather than a burden. The binding had changed her. She stood tall, her thick thighs planted firmly on the hardwood, her chest rising and falling with a calm, predatory rhythm. The silk nightgown clung to her generous curves, but she no longer wanted to hide them. Alistair had called her a queen, and with his blood singing in her veins, she was beginning to believe it. "They are at the edge of the property," Alistair said. He stood in the center of the room, shedding the cashmere sweater. Beneath it, he wore a custom-fitted tactical vest over a black Henley, the dark fabric emphasizing the terrifying coiled muscle of his chest and arms. He strapped a pair of silver alloy trench knives to his thighs. "The trackers are confused. Your scent is entirely masked. They are running blind in the mud." "But they know you are here," Brittany said, her voice steady, surprising even herself with its cold clarity. "Yes," Alistair replied, walking over to her. He framed her soft, round face with his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. His eyes were entirely black now, the ancient monster rising to the surface to defend its mate. "Bastien Moreau is an arrogant creature. When his hounds fail, he will rely on brute force. He has brought 60 mercenaries and 20 of his own cartel vampires to break down my doors. And you have 70 guards," Brittany noted, feeling the tactical map of the estate in her mind, a side effect of the bond. "I do not need my guards to deal with Bastien," Alistair growled, pressing a hard, bruising kiss to her forehead. "I need my guards to ensure none of the vermin slip past me and reach this room. You are to stay here. Dominic has sealed the library doors with blood iron lock mechanisms. Nothing short of a military explosive can breach them." A sudden, earth-shattering explosion rocked the estate. The floorboards trembled, and the crystal chandelier above them swung violently, casting jagged shadows across the room. The perimeter gates had been breached. Alistair's lips curled back, revealing his elongated, razor-sharp fangs. "They have invited themselves in. I must teach them the manners of a guest." He turned and blurred toward the heavy mahogany doors, vanishing into the corridor before Brittany could even blink. The heavy locking mechanisms slammed shut behind him, echoing with a final metallic clack. Brittany was alone, but she was not frightened. She closed her eyes and leaned back against the windowsill, sinking into the bond. It was like tuning a radio to a hidden frequency. Suddenly the library fell away, and she was in Alistair's mind. She saw the grand foyer through his eyes, the shattered remnants of the front doors, the rain blowing into the pristine entranceway, and then the invaders. Dozens of armed mercenaries poured into the house, their tactical flashlights cutting through the gloom, laser sights dancing across the Italian marble. They were heavily armed humans paid in blood money by the Moreau cartel, expecting a simple raid. They had no idea they had just stepped into the lair of the first king. Through the bond, Brittany felt Alistair's absolute lack of fear. It was replaced by a cold, calculating wrath. He dropped from the second-floor landing like a stone gargoyle recoil, crashing directly into the center of the mercenary squad. The marble floor cracked under his boots. The slaughter was instantaneous and completely silent on his part. Brittany felt the sheer devastating kinetic force as Alistair tore through the armed men. He moved faster than the human eye could process, snapping necks and shattering ribs with a casual, horrifying grace. The silver trench knives flashed in the darkness, cutting down anyone who raised a weapon. Bullets rained through the air, tearing into the walls and destroying centuries-old artwork. But Alistair moved between the projectiles like water. Brittany gasped, her hands clutching her stomach, feeling a phantom echo of his physical exertion. It wasn't painful. It was an intoxicating rush of pure adrenaline. She felt the moment Alistair tasted the blood in the air, his predatory senses shifting from the human mercenaries to the real threat, the cartel vampires entering the fray. "Stay safe, my king," she pushed the thought through the psychic tether, hoping he could hear her. An immediate wave of profound, fierce affection washed back over her, followed by a dark, vibrating mental growl. "Always my queen." The library doors suddenly shuddered. Brittany's eyes snapped open. The battle in the foyer was raging, but someone had bypassed the main conflict. Someone had climbed the outer walls of the estate and reached the second-floor terrace. The reinforced glass of the library windows exploded inward. Brittany threw her arms up, turning away, as shards of glass rained down around her. The storm howled into the room, bringing with it the metallic stench of wet copper and decay. Standing amidst the ruined curtains was Bastien Moreau. He was a tall, skeletal vampire with sallow skin, dressed in an immaculate, albeit soaked white suit. His eyes were a sickly, jaundiced yellow, and his mouth was stretched into a cruel, arrogant smile. Two massive, hulking cartel enforcers stepped through the shattered window behind him, their fangs fully extended. "Well, well," Bastien hissed, his voice like dry leaves scraping over stone. "Alistair's little human pet. You cause my family a great deal of financial inconvenience, Fatty, and the seers were right. You smell absolutely divine. I can practically taste the first sire's blood radiating off your skin." Brittany didn't scream, she didn't cower. She stood in the center of the room, her bare feet planted on the Persian rug. She squared her broad shoulders, allowing the satin gown to ripple around her thick, powerful frame. The fear that had defined her entire human existence had been burned away by Alistair's bite. "You are trespassing," Brittany said, her voice echoing with an unnatural dual resonance, her own voice layered with the dark, commanding timbre of the king's psychic echo. Bastien laughed, a hollow, grating sound. "The pig thinks it can speak. Grab her, drain her dry. I want Alistair to feel her die." The two enforcers lunged. They expected a terrified, heavy-footed mortal. They expected her to trip, to fall, to beg for her life. They did not expect the blood binding. As the first enforcer reached her, his claws extended to rip into her soft shoulder, Brittany's instincts fueled by the ancient predatory reflex granted by Alistair's blood took over. She didn't move away, she stepped inside his guard. With a speed that defied her size, she brought her forearm up, deflecting his strike, and drove her open palm squarely into the center of his chest. The impact sounded like a cannon going off. The vampire was thrown backward with the force of a freight train, crashing through a solid oak bookshelf and collapsing into a pile of splintered wood and first editions, his ribcage entirely caved in. Bastien's yellow eyes widened in sheer disbelief. "What the hell are you?" Before the second enforcer could process his comrade's defeat, the heavy blood-iron-locked doors of the library didn't just open, they were ripped entirely out of their reinforced frames. Alistair stood in the threshold, completely drenched in the blood of the cartel mercenaries. He was a vision of absolute biblical destruction. His bespoke clothing was torn, revealing skin that was rapidly healing from minor bullet grazes, but his eyes were fixed entirely on Bastien. The aura radiating off the king was so dense, so terrifyingly oppressive, that the remaining cartel enforcer dropped to his knees, completely paralyzed by supernatural dread. "You touched my door," Alistair whispered, stepping over the ruined wood. "And you looked at my wife. She has your strength." Bastien stammered, backing away toward the shattered window, his arrogance evaporating into primal terror. "You bound a sanguis regis. You fool. The council will execute you for hoarding that power. You broke the accords. I am the accords." Alistair roared, the sound shattering the remaining intact glass in the room. He didn't blur. He simply vanished from the doorway and reappeared directly in front of Bastion. Alistair's hand shot out his long fingers, wrapping around Bastion's throat. He lifted the cartel leader entirely off the ground. Bastion clawed desperately at Alistair's arm, but it was like scraping fingernails against solid titanium. Alistair looked past the choking vampire and locked eyes with Brittany. He saw that she was unharmed, perfectly poised, her chest heaving with adrenaline. He felt her unwavering support pouring through the bond, amplifying his own strength to godlike levels. By binding her, he hadn't just protected her. Her royal blood was feeding his ancient magic, making him entirely unstoppable. "You called her a pig," Alistair said softly, turning his attention back to Bastion. "You insulted the woman who holds my soul." With a sickening fluid motion, Alistair drove his free hand directly into Bastion's chest. The sound of ribs snapping echoed loudly in the quiet moments between thunderclaps. Bastion let out a wet, strangled gasp, his yellow eyes bulging as Alistair's hand closed around his cold, dead heart. "Tell the shadows of the underworld," Alistair whispered, "that the King of Bedford is no longer ruling alone." Alistair ripped his hand backward. Bastion's body went instantly horrifyingly limp. Alistair tossed the lifeless husk out the shattered window into the raging storm, disposing of the cartel leader like a piece of rotting garbage. The remaining enforcer, still kneeling on the floor, pressed his face to the rug, whimpering in terror. Alistair looked down at him, his black eyes devoid of mercy. "Return to Manhattan. Tell the Moreau family that the debt is settled. If they ever look toward Connecticut again, I will not wait for them to come to me. I will burn their city to the bedrock. Go." The enforcer scrambled to his feet and threw himself out the window, vanishing into the night. The battle was over. The estate was in ruins, the foyer filled with bodies, the library destroyed, but the war had been won. Alistair stood in the center of the debris, his chest heaving, his hands coated in blood. Slowly, the abyssal black receded from his eyes, returning to the warm, deep hazel. The monstrous veins beneath his skin faded. He looked at Brittany, suddenly uncertain, acutely aware of the carnage he had just inflicted right in front of her. "I am a monster bee," he whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden, profound vulnerability. "I am sorry you had to see that." Brittany didn't hesitate. She didn't shrink away from the blood or the violence. She walked across the ruined Persian rug, her thick, soft hips swaying with a newfound majestic confidence. She stopped right in front of him and reached out, uncaring of the gore on his chest, and wrapped her arms tightly around his waist. She rested her cheek against his heart, listening to the slow, steady, immortal rhythm. "You are my monster," Brittany corrected softly, her hands sliding up to cup his blood-stained face. She pulled him down, pressing her lips to his in a deep, bruising kiss that tasted of rain copper and absolute devotion. Alistair groaned, wrapping his arms around her generous curves, lifting her slightly off the floor. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, right over the golden crest of his bite mark, breathing in the scent of his queen. The world had tried to break Brittany Gallagher. It had tried to tell her she was too big, too loud, too much of a burden for anyone to carry. But in the arms of the Vampire King, surrounded by the ruins of those who had tried to destroy them, she knew the truth. She wasn't a burden. She was an empire, and together they would rule for eternity. If you were captivated by Brittany and Alistair's dark, romantic journey from a brutal beginning to an empire of eternal devotion, don't keep this thrilling story to yourself. Please like this video to show your support. Share it with fellow dark romance lovers who crave a story about power, vengeance, and a fiercely beautiful queen who learns her true worth. And subscribe to the channel for more immersive, pulse-pounding supernatural tales every week. Turn on notifications so you never miss a twist, because the night is always full of secrets.